Okay, good afternoon. I am Jerry Anthony. I'm a faculty member in the School of Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Iowa. A warm welcome to all of you to this webinar. Our featured guest today is Misty Rebik, Chief of Staff for Senator Bernie Sanders. Now, before she starts speaking on the topic, advancing public policy through a federal budget reconciliation process, let me briefly tell you our agenda for the day. I'm going to take about 2-3 minutes to introduce Misty, and then she'll have about 30 to 40 minutes to talk about the topic of the day. And then after that, she's going to talk a little bit about her career, maybe 10 to 15 minutes about her career and key points in her professional life. And then after that, we have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. So participants can send in their questions. These questions will be going straight to my colleague, Anne, and she will compile all of these questions. And then after Misty finishes her presentations, the two parts of her presentation, when we enter the Q&A, I will pose these questions to Misty and she will respond to them. Or so I hope. Yes, Misty? Let me briefly introduce Misty. Who is Misty Rebek? Well, born and raised in Iowa, Misty Rebek is the Chief of Staff for Senator Bernie Sanders, the senator in charge of the Senate Budget Committee. Misty joined his Senate office recently. Before that, she was serving as the executive director of Friends of Bernie Sanders, the senator's political campaign committee during the 2020 primary and general election. Before that, Misty held several leadership positions in the Bernie 2020 campaign. Initially, as the Iowa State Director, and then eventually leading the National Organizing Committee. Misty cut her teeth in organizing with the Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement and ran her first electoral campaign as campaign manager during the Iowa 2018 primary season for the Iowa gubernatorial candidate and nurse, Kathy Glasson. She's been very active in electoral campaigns, but before entering the electoral arena, Misty served as regional director of strategic partnerships and development of Eastern Iowa with Planned Parenthood of the Heartland. There, she directed major donor and event programs in Eastern Iowa and worked to build a strong network of partnerships and support within the area. While at Planned Parenthood, Misty spearheaded the development of the transgender care program at the Cedar Rapids Health Clinic and founded the BAR. Now, the BAR has nothing to do with alcohol or the legal system. BAR stands for Born After Roe. And the BAR group aimed at engaging millennials in advocacy and fundraising for reproductive and sexual health. Misty is the co-founder and former executive director for the Center for Worker Justice of Eastern Iowa, the CWJ. And people in Iowa City know this center very, very well. It has been at the forefront of many, many progressive campaigns in Iowa City for the last 7, 8, maybe 8 years. While at CWJ, Misty helped lead and win campaigns that established the first county minimum wage ordinance in the entire state of Iowa. She established the first ever community identification program in the Midwest and taught dozens of adult education workshops all over Eastern Iowa. Misty is a former board member of Iowa CCI Action. She's a co-founder and co-host of the political party Live, a podcast aimed at engaging millennials in politics through art and culture and entertainment. Misty holds a BA in International Studies, emphasizing in Latin American Studies with a Spanish minor. And she has, and I'm so proud of this, an MS in Urban and Regional Planning. Both these are from the University of Iowa. Misty speaks, reads, and writes Spanish. Over to Misty.
All right, let's get this show on the road. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I am so excited to be here with so many people who I care a lot about and a state that I care dearly about. I've been living in DC for a little while now, and I'm going to get real DC on you for the first half hour here, and we're going to be talking a lot about the reconciliation process. So I'm going to be focused on how did we advance public policy through the federal reconciliation process. But the bottom line really, I think, is how and why did 20% of the lowest American income earners get a 20% income boost in this bill, while the wealthy 1% will get zero? And you've been hearing a lot about it. It's called the American Rescue Plan. So you probably recall right around the time that the new president was inaugurated, we started to see headlines like this. What is reconciliation? Democrats face hurdles to get the COVID relief package. It didn't quite have a name yet. We were calling it COVID relief. And then things just started to go really quickly after the president was inaugurated. And you started to hear things about the Senate parliamentarian. There's my boss right there. That photo, I believe, also went viral. Another one, Senate prepares to take up a 1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. So this is happening all through February. We're getting in, end of January, end of February. And then you see the House gives final approval to Biden's 1.9 trillion pandemic relief bill. Then it's signed into law. It's called the American Rescue Plan. It's the third stimulus bill. There's Biden signing it. And then you start to hear about things like this. The US is about to start a massive experiment in progressive government, and it's all Bernie Sanders, the scary, scary chairman of the budget committee. So I'm going to go into a little bit about what this package means and how we got here. But first, I want to talk about the popularity of the bill. So you may hear some Republican, senators talking about how this $1.9 trillion stimulus bill is just too much. There's way too much in this bill. But in fact, poll after poll, and really when we were even putting it together, shows that all voters of every identity, independent, Republican, Democrat, of all age groups are overwhelmingly supportive of this bill. In fact, 45% of voters say that it had the right amount, while almost 24%, almost 25% really said it didn't have enough. So, over 60% or so of people saying, actually, this bill didn't have enough. So just kind of pushing it back against some of those narratives you might be hearing. And this is a great study from the Morning Consult. This just came out this week, again, showing incredible support from people of all walks of life for this bill. The direct payments, the $1,400 direct payments that people should be getting right now, the extension of the $300 unemployment benefits, the expansion of the child tax credit. I'll get into all of these things a little bit more later. But as you can see, the stimulus checks, one of the most important, I believe, and one of the most important parts of the bill, but also one of the most important parts of the bill has 79% support across registered voters, so independents and Republicans. Another important thing here, I think, is that 51% of Republicans backed extending the unemployment benefits, the extra $300 a week, and also that extension on the child tax credit. So important things there. And really, there's numbers kind of in all different polling here that between 70, sometimes 68%, but between about 70 and 80% of Americans are really happy with the American Rescue Plan. So let's talk about how we made it happen. Let's talk about what is reconciliation. I was doing some research last night and saw a lot of different news outlets were writing, what is reconciliation, about a month ago, because no one really knew what it was. So basically, reconciliation is a way to enact legislation on taxes, spending, and the debt limit. It's essentially a way to avoid using the filibuster because you can get this approved by using only a majority. So obviously in the Senate, you need 60 votes to pass any regular piece of legislation. And the reconciliation process, if it matches all of the requirements, can actually get passed with just a majority, so 51. The first use of this sort of act really happened back in the 1980s. And since then, there's been 21 bills enacted using this process, which I think is very important. Though 25 attempted, I believe, but those all got vetoed by the president. Really, the goal of reconciliation is to allow Congress and the Senate to respond to the needs of the moment, is to really be able to reflect what's happening in the country and get things done. So this is where I get a little bit wonky on you. I'm going to try to, I'll probably take questions at the end if you have further. I'm going to blaze through this quickly so we can talk about some of the more juicy stuff. But basically, Congress is supposed to pass a blueprint for taxes and spending bills every year through a budget resolution. They don't do that always, like we didn't do it last year, mostly because we knew the House and the Senate would not come in agreement on that when we had President Trump as the president and a House majority and a Senate, Democratic House majority and a Senate majority of Republicans. But when it does happen, a budget resolution requires the approval of majority votes. So that's where you see the budget resolution is basically like the main number we're agreeing to. It requires a majority vote, not the 60 vote, to get through the House and the Senate. Once that happens is when the House and the Senate agree on what they call reconciliation instructions, which essentially is the dollar targets to committees to raise or lower spending revenues for that given fiscal year. So we worked with 11 committees on this bill, from finance to education and labor. All of the different committees essentially were responsible for producing what we call instructions to create the amendments of the bill. And then we do what is called a bird bath. And that is, I'll talk more about where that comes from, but the bird bath essentially is each caucus goes in front of the parliamentarian and talks about, why they believe their amendment should fit into this process called reconciliation. And then even after that, there's a very interesting process that happens where there's bipartisan presentation to the parls. That's what we say in the Senate, which is the parliamentarian. So basically there's a bipartisan moment where everybody brings forward their amendments and is making the argument that it maintains privilege, it complies with the bird law, the bird amendment, and that it should be a part of the bill, right? Once we get through all of that, then you've probably heard of another crazy term called vote-a-rama. And we get into a vote-a-rama, which is basically where this bill comes to the floor and anybody can present endless amendments to the bill. And essentially what happens in that process is that the leadership of both parties decide which amendments are going to get a vote. As an example, the first time we went through after budget resolution through the vote-a-rama before we actually got the reconciliation bill, we were on the Senate floor from about 2 p.m. until about 5 a.m. And, Leader Schumer and McConnell were agreeing of the 800 amendments, which ones we were going to vote on. And each amendment takes about 15 minutes to get a vote. And then this time around, once we had the actual reconciliation, we'd gone through that bird bath, we were on the Senate floor for 27 hours. We did not finish on Saturday until 11 a.m. And it was quite the experience, and took a little bit of time to recover from, but that is kind of how vote-a-rama works. Basically, anybody gets presented an amendment, they make 30-second arguments on each end, and then it gets a yay or a no or a nay vote, and you move on to the next amendment. So it's just like a very fast-paced, sometimes slow process. And then lastly, the president signs the bill. So that is a lot. Two things you heard me say: the bird rule and the parliamentarian. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background because I think this is interesting. The bird rule actually comes from a former senator from West Virginia named Robert Byrd. He was a Democrat, very, very well known in Congress for doing all sorts of great things for the state of West Virginia. And the bird rule, essentially is what limits the content of the budget reconciliation with the goal of excluding non-budgetary matters from the legislation. So we essentially apply this to something so that we're not doing like policy making, but rather budget making. And so essentially, if something does not comply with the bird rule, then it does not have privilege. Privilege basically means that an amendment can be fast-tracked through the reconciliation process to allow it to get through with just 51 votes rather than the 60 votes. If an amendment does not have privilege, it would require then 60 votes. You can bring an amendment through the reconciliation process that does require 60 votes. We did that with the minimum wage, for example. So you can do that. But again, if you don't get those 60 votes, it won't go through. So if you want it to be fast-tracked and you want it to be able to be a part of the larger package of getting the 51 votes, it has to comply with the bird rule. And the person who determines that is the parliamentarian. And the reason I laugh about this is because when I was trying to explain this to lots of different people in my life, they just really had no idea that there was this non-elected staff person. We like her a lot, but who essentially kind of uses her own judgment based off of the past and decides if something is within bird rule compliance or not. And so the parliamentarian plays a very, very big role in this. And the other thing that's important to know is that though the parliamentarian may rule against something and say, actually, this is not reconcilable, or I don't believe this matches the bird rule, the vice president can actually overrule the parliamentarian. I don't know if that's ever happened. I can't remember when we were looking through history, but it can happen. So why would we do this? This is very complicated. Why not just pass regular legislation? I wanted to kind of make the case for this. We've seen this used for a long time, especially when there's a slim majority in power, like we have right now. So right now in the Senate, we've got 50 Republicans, we have 48 Democrats and 2 independents, one of whom is my boss, Bernie Sanders. And then we have, a Democratic ran House, a Democrat in the president's seat. So we have a Dem trifecta, but truly on a very, very slim margin. So keeping the caucus together is very, very important when we're trying to vote through these things. And sometimes the easiest way to do that is to package a bunch of things together that give cover to some people in their districts that it maybe wouldn't be great for them to vote on otherwise, but because it's a part of this thing that has a lot of great things in it, they can, or vice versa. Sometimes that's how bad things happen as well. And it's used to just get stuff done quickly, right? It's there to facilitate the president's agenda. And we have seen this happen, like I said in the beginning, 21 bills so far. I want to just name out some of this stuff because I think it's really interesting how it's shifted over these last 20 years. So we saw reconciliation used, to pass the major deficit reduction bills in the 80s and the 90s, welfare reform back in 96, the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, the Trump tax cuts of 2017, which are about the same amount of money of this bill. Just to be really clear, this 1.9 trillion that we just passed, it's about the same amount of money. I think it's a little, it's like $1.8 trillion that went mostly to providing corporations tax cuts and wealthy folks tax cuts. So, people of different walks of life use this differently, right? We also know that the reconciliation process was used several times to try to repeal or change the Affordable Care Act, and President Obama actually vetoed an attempt back in 2016. And there's a few Republicans who actually blocked the vote blocked the effort in 2017. So presidents use this process to get their agenda done. And there's really no difference here. I wanted to also just show two very big differences. So this is an example of one thing that got passed through reconciliation when Trump was in office. Trump actually was able to pass through the reconciliation process the ability to start drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, okay? And then meanwhile, the Senate parliamentarian ruled against our efforts to include the minimum wage, which clearly has an effect on the budget. So I just use those as two very stark differences in kind of how some things have been allowed to go through while some things have not. So it is not a clear cut process necessarily, even though, we claim that it is. So what is in the American Rescue Plan? So I'm just going to kind of start with the conditions. Really important, because when you go back and you look at why this stuff was getting done, there's conditions around all of those things. There was a narrative in this country about austerity, debt, that was really pushing presidents' agendas, Clinton's even, right? And then, we're in a different moment in time, right? So over 500,000 Americans are dead because of COVID-19. 30 million more are infected of COVID. We know that 90 million Americans, while we're in a global pandemic, are uninsured or underinsured, so cannot get the healthcare they need or get tests and things that they may need. We're quite literally facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. We have 10 million fewer jobs than we did last March. 20 million Americans are collecting unemployment. 40 million people are facing eviction. We have 500,000 people homeless during a pandemic, not able to wash their hands, not able to, do proper sanitation. And we have seen business ownership plummet, especially with small businesses. So small business owners have plummeted by 3.3 million people. That is a lot. That is 22% reduction in business owners over the last year or so. And 41% of that Black business owners. So not surprisingly, we know in this moment, racial inequity is highlighted more than ever, and Black and brown folks have been impacted more by the pandemic than anybody. And then just pure chaos on our education system, as you all know, right? Like trying to figure out how to do higher education. What do you do with early ed? Trying to obviously teach our children from home, very complicated stuff. So this American Rescue Plan literally responds to the conditions that we are facing in this country right now. There's a ton of economic and social solutions. First and foremost, the president really wanted to focus on our vaccine effort. As you know, he now is telling us that we believe we will have enough vaccines in this country for everybody by May 1. That's a huge improvement. We were not even close to that just a month ago, but we got to get, vaccines in people's arms. So a big part of that money is going to that. We're aiming to cut child poverty in half. We're extending unemployment, which is literally the lifeline for so many people right now. Tons of aid to working families. We're ensuring that state and local governments can survive and don't have to furlough their employees. Resources to schools, as we know the times are different, and how are we going to continue to educate folks? And then, of course, there's a lot of housing and nutrition assistance. One thing you do not see on this very broad list is tax cuts to the wealthy or corporations. This is one of the first bills in a very long time of this magnitude of $1.9 trillion, where zero money went to the top 1%. And I'm very proud of that. So you hear some of this new stuff. Now the new kind of line is, the American Rescue Plan, this $1.9 trillion bill kind of makes us think of FDR and LBJ, right? So you start to hear people comparing President Biden to FDR and LBJ. People are calling the American Rescue Plan Joe Biden's New Deal. And even my boss is saying, and was saying, back in January when the Georgia elections were still happening, was saying Joe Biden is going to be the most progressive president that we've seen in recent history since FDR. So let's remind ourselves of who FDR is. So, I think it's really important to kind of remember history sometimes, because I believe the package that we just passed is to this level. President Franklin Roosevelt did the New Deal. If you're in urban regional planning, you're going to learn all about it. And it was a really, really important focus at the time. It brought together white working people, African-American folks, and women, and it brought them all into the workforce. And though, there's been some splintering around, and some of the programs that we enforced at the time, started at the time, don't exist. A lot of them do. And most notably, Social Security, unemployment insurance, and support to agriculture. So FDR really turned around the country following the Great Depression with some of the commitments that he made to fund and social programs for really the first time in our country. And then, you have Lyndon B Johnson, who only served one term, but did some interesting things. He was flawed, of course, all presidents are, but he had the Great Society, right? So he helped to champion programs like Medicare, Head Start, the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act. And really it was a lot of what he was doing that helped to create Medicare and Medicaid programs, large in part what many people are depending on today, especially as we're facing the pandemic. He also did some work on reducing air and water pollution. So it's beginning to really pay attention to the environmental stuff that was happening. So these are two presidents who in the past decided, like during their tenure, they were going to respond to the conditions of the moment they're in and show up for the working class. And I believe that is what President Biden just did. And I believe, that was what my boss as the budget chairman was focused on doing. So I'm going to highlight just a few pieces of this bill, and then we're going to get into the politics. Affordable housing, something that many of you probably care about and are working on. Jerry Anthony teaches amazing classes about it. But one key piece I want you to see out of this reconciliation bill, what this looks like on a local level, is that we doubled the funding that's going to the National House Trust Fund. So that is an incredible thing to be doing. So that money is going to go to preserve and fix up affordable rental housing for extremely low income families. And again, that is double the funding in just this year. We just did that in this bill. In addition, we put $45 billion in rental and utility assistance. It's really important that folks know that right now, millions of Americans owe back rent and utilities. It's not just rent, it's utilities. We can't have our utilities going under, right? So we have provided, relief there. And then just ongoing investments in housing to address homelessness. So making sure that we are helping people who are finding themselves homeless for the first time or who may have been homeless for a long time get the resources we need. So a very big bill at the national level coming down. And it's actually this bill, I don't know what it's going to provide in Iowa. I didn't have the time to look it up, but that means $3 million allocated to the trust fund in Vermont. So for small states, that is a lot of money, right? And what are we going to be able to do with that money on the issues that matter so much to us? So it is up to the local agencies, or the federal agencies and local agencies to kind of disperse that out and figure out how it works. But planners and policymakers and electeds and working people should have a voice in that. So I hope people are paying attention to how this money comes down locally. Another important thing that happened in this bill, and there's some supposed controversy about this because some of the Republican senators argue that it shouldn't be on the federal budget to take care of, bad management of local governments. The reality is that most local governments and state local governments are going through something they never have before, and we need them functioning if we're going to get back to life as normal ever, or post-pandemic life, whatever that's going to look like. And so we fought tooth and nail to keep $350 billion into this budget that is going straight direct to the states. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, and again, this is what you can do when you're legislating through different committees, is Bernie Sanders worked tirelessly to maintain what we call the state minimum, to make sure that small rural states don't just get allocated based off of how many people on unemployment or some of these other factors that obviously those numbers are going to be lower in low population states. So not a great formula. So we fought to keep that formula where all states get a minimum of $500 million going to their state and local government. And you can see that there's some other things in here too. Very important, the $20 billion going to tribal governments as well. But just another example of how a big federal bill like this can have true impacts on local government. And this one, I really can't say enough about this. I mean, through this bill, we are cutting childhood poverty in half in this country. Our childhood poverty in the United States is dismal. I mean, it's almost 14%, more than most other developed countries, and it really needs to be dealt with. And by a combination of direct cash payments of, most families of four, so dependents also get that $1,400. We get $5,600, boom, right into your bank account. That is a huge chunk of money for most working people. And it's truly is going to help lift people out of poverty during this time. But something else really phenomenal about this bill that I'm not quite sure people really understand is the child tax credit. So we extended that from $3,000 to $3,000 to $3,600 for young children, but it's also like a monthly payment. So if you have a child, you're going to be getting a $300 payment a month from the government. I mean, that is incredible. And other countries do this across the country. Basically, it's guaranteed income for children to make sure that children can eat and are housed. Having a child costs a lot more money. This is not a radical idea in many other places, but it's very radical in the United States, or it has been deemed as radical. And we've never done something like this before. This is the first time in a very long time, if ever, that I know of, that we've provided direct payments. And then on top of that, providing some sort of security for families, and not just in a tax credit, which I think is important for people to know, because in order to really benefit from a tax credit, you got to make some money. And if you're not making any money, that doesn't really help you, right? So inadvertently, the tax credit is great for, more middle-class families, not great for someone who's unemployed, not great for a single mom, but this is good. And you can see how it especially affects children of color. And I think that's very important as we are talking about how this bill can lift up specific communities. It really does address a lot of racial inequity in our country. Here's a really quick, we'd have to spend forever for me to go through all of the parts of the bill, but a couple of things, I just want you to make sure you know about. There's billions of dollars for public health workforce, community healthcare centers. You may be surprised, but it was my boss who helped to get that line item, making sure that federally qualified healthcare centers got a big boost in funding. So that's also there. Support to the ACA and, childcare support, nutrition support, public transit, which has been decimated during this time because people are not using it. So we're trying to keep public transit alive. In that same vein, there's Amtrak is able to rehire back 1,200 furloughed workers. And all of this, like maybe on the national level seems small, but we know what this can mean at the national level. So I just wanted to quickly give you guys sort of a laundry list there. Okay, moving right along. How did this happen? So, one of the things that I think we can't understate is how dramatically we've been able to shift the narrative from austerity politics, from cutting, worrying about the national budget, to aggressively fighting poverty. And, if you know anything about Joe Biden, he has been an austerity guy. He has been someone for a very long time, cared about the deficit, cared deeply about going into debt, participated as a senator in a lot of austerity policies. And now, what we're seeing here is a bill that essentially breaks a 25-year bipartisan consensus that the very poor should not be eligible for cash payments. I mean, there has been this ongoing argument in this country for a long time that if you give money to poor people, they won't work, right? And we just know that's not true. And the data shows that over and over again. So really, this is a watershed moment. And I think it's really important that we stop and think about how we got here. So this is a little bit of a weird slide, but I decided to go into my inbox and pull out some of the recent emails that I've been getting. And you can see it's like, there's a lot of interesting things happening here. Filibuster, a lot of conversation about the filibuster. We need to deliver $15 minimum wage. Cotton and Romney, Republicans are talking about a minimum wage. It may not be 15, but they're starting to talk about a $10 minimum wage. We see this sort of like this narrative around Bernie Sanders and Joe Manchin from West Virginia boxing this thing out. And what I wanted to just pay attention to here on the right is kind of how these narratives were before and after something. So obviously the election was a big deal, but let's just even talk post-election. I'm talking like 3 months here. So there was a big checks fight that went down at the end of December. You may remember Bernie Sanders was on the floor per usual, yelling about something, right? And he was yelling about how the COVID relief bill must have direct payments. There's not going to be any direct payments in that bill. We didn't get $2,000, but we got $600, right? And it was interesting because before that, no one was talking about it. After that, everybody's talking about it, including the 2 senators who are running for office in Georgia. And the president at the time, President Trump was actually saying people should get direct payments. So it was a really interesting shift in time. And then before reconciliation, there was some conversation about what is called, eliminating the filibuster. So getting rid of this idea in the Senate that you got to have 60 votes to get anything done. Everybody was against it. The president was against it. Manchin, who is a Democrat, but is from, tends to be more conservative or what we call moderate. We're just not even engaging in that conversation. Absolutely no. But once we got through reconciliation and we're kind of talking about the future, all of a sudden you hear the president kind of opening up what it might take to overrule or maybe change the filibuster rule. You hear Manchin loosening his grip on that as well. Minimum wage. So we have been fighting for the minimum wage for a long time. As you know, the minimum wage failed in this bill. But before, lots of people say no way. We had 8 Democrats vote against it on the floor. Many of those Democrats have been talking about how they support a $15 minimum wage now, right? And then I just want to talk one really quick thing about Manchin, and I want to bring it up because it's all over the news, and it's that there's this big idea that, Manchin played this huge role in this reconciliation bill, and I think it's fair to say that Manchin tweaked the edge of it, but the whole premise of this bill, direct payments, unemployment, cutting childhood poverty, in half, all of that remained. Very, very, very small thing changed, which is the extension of unemployment. He was able to negotiate it down by 3 weeks. So it still goes through the end of September. We still have time to address that. But I just think it's important to kind of put some of that into perspective. Now we're getting into the fun things. I couldn't do a presentation without using the most famous meme of my boss. There's several famous memes across the country, but there's literally a time when I was on Twitter and Facebook and Bernie was in every picture I saw. It was a very funny time, but so what are the conditions that allowed this to happen? I clearly have some bias because I work for Senator Sanders, but I also have been an organizer my whole life. And what I can tell you is there's been a shifting narrative in this country over the last 6 years. And we're going to talk more about that, but talking about what we should demand of government, what we need from our elected officials. And Bernie Sanders' run for president back in 2015 and 2016 was a huge part of that. Also, the Occupy movement, the 99% versus the 1%. There has been a rising up of the narrative shift for several years now, but definitely in the last 6 years, we've seen that shift. The current president also campaigned on a lot of popular working class ideas. Joe Biden comes from a union family. He talks a lot, he took the train to DC. He's got this very working class vibe about him, and he campaigned on it. And I think that was important. we learned some lessons from the Obama era, right? Like one of the things I've heard from the president, I've heard from more centrist, political operatives, is that they didn't do a great job at, lifting up what Obama did, but also they spent a lot of time on bipartisanship, not getting a lot done. The progressive squad is growing in Congress. AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, that grew a lot with Jamal Bowman, Mondaire Jones, Cori Bush. And you have people like Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal from Washington. You've got Mark Pocan, who's also part of the progressive caucus from Wisconsin. There is a growing large cohort of progressive caucus members in the House, which is important because they drive a lot of narrative as well. You saw Trump's presidency attract working class people to the Republican Party. So for the first time in a long time, Republicans began to get a hold of what the Democrats for a long time considered their base, working class people. And not just white working class people, which is what a lot of people think. But if you look back at this recent election, you will see that Trump peeled off Black working men and Latinos as well, quite a bit. And so I think that also creates a condition that makes people kind of pay attention to what's happening. The direct payments fight in December, I already mentioned this in the Georgia election, were kind of like this perfect political moment, right? And then all of a sudden you've got two very prominent people, Warnock and Ossoff in Georgia, talking about direct payments. I think more and more we've seen economic books and popular economists coming out and talking about austerity politics and how those have been very bad and have widened the gap of income inequality in our country. And of course, for a long time now in my experience, but specifically nationally over the last summer in June, we saw the rising up of people very angry about the racial inequities in this country and the violence that Black people face in this country. And then you got a new budget chairman, so before the budget chairman, was a little bit more moderate. He was not interested in doing a bunch of hearings. And now we have this very active chairperson, Bernie Sanders. So this is like my favorite part of the talk, and I really can't wait to get into your guys' questions. So how do you create the conditions to create public policy that actually works for the majority? And when I'm talking about the majority, I'm not talking about a political class. I'm talking about the working class. I'm talking about working people in this country. So I have a long background in organizing, so I'm going to say organize. I wholeheartedly believe that without organizing, what we saw happen in this package would not have happened. I am talking about the unions, SEIU, Fight for 15. I'm talking about groups like CWJ in Iowa. I'm talking about immigrant rights groups, Sunrise, about climate change, organizing to raise awareness and mobilizing everyday people around these issues. You got to create coalitions. So find ways to work together. The more that we can do that, the stronger we are, and the more that you are going to win on whatever public policy thing you want to get done. You got to bring people of different walks of life to the table and build unity and build coalitions. Not build unity like just to it's important to draw a line around what you are promoting, but you do have to be willing to build some coalitions. You got to build power. I'm talking more about power in a second, but we live in a country, we live in a world that powerful people make decisions that affect the large majority of us. So you have to figure out how to build power to hold those powerful people accountable, which gets me to candidates and electeds. What does accountability look like with your local electeds and with other candidates who are running for office? You gotta utilize media to get the message out about whatever piece of policy that you're trying to push. And I truly believe, still to this day, I love data, my boss loves data, that storytelling is more impactful than just doing another report or telling me a bunch of numbers. Numbers make politicians' eyes glaze over. It makes everyday working people's eyes glaze over. Numbers can be powerful, but you got to tell a story. You have to talk about how the issue that you're working on impacts people's lives, right? That is the thing that changes hearts and minds. And then I will always say you have to center regular people's voices. So you are a practitioner as an urban regional planner, you are a political operative, whatever you may be. in order to get the work done around the issues that you care about, you've got to work with regular people, because those people know firsthand about what's happening and how your specific project or policy is going to change their life, or maybe have some like very unintended consequences, right? So it's so important to center the voices of working people, of people who are directly affected by the issue. So how do we change what's politically possible? You organize. And this is I think back in 2014 in Iowa City. There I am with Board of Supervisor Janelle Rettig. We are fighting for 15. We actually recruited elected officials to be a part of our campaign. This campaign was led mostly by, people of color, poor working people making $7.25 an hour. And we were able to pass the ordinance not only in Johnson County, Lynn County, and Polk County. What happened to that at the State House, we can get into later, but it was a very powerful campaign, and it took about 2 years to get done. Community ID. Here we are again at the Johnson County building. That is Amaris there in the front with that little sign that says Community ID. We created the Community ID program. We came up with this idea as a response to over-policing of communities of color. So I know how we're all talking about this right now, but when we first started organizing at the Center for Worker Justice, what was originally called the Immigrant Voices Project, the number one issue that I heard was police harassment. The number one issue over and over again. Didn't matter if you were Latino, if you're African, if you were African-American, people were being harassed constantly by the police. And one of the big problems was people didn't have IDs to even ID themselves. So they're being arrested and they're going to jail. And so we did some research and came up with some solutions. We met regularly with the police, with the sheriff, with city officials from Iowa City, Johnson County Board of Supervisors, and it was a 3-year-long campaign to explain to people why this was an important local policy, but we got it done. And now anybody in the county can have an ID, including children, which is a great safety mechanism. And you can open up bank accounts, you do all sorts of different things and really, truly become an inclusive member of your community. It doesn't fix all the problems for sure. I'm the first to admit that, but it worked. Here we are marching to the Johnson County building. And here we are just last spring. That is Bernie Sanders. That's me holding all those water bottles. And right next to me with that blonde hair and glasses is my other former boss, Kathy Glosson, SEIU nurse and leader. So there we were about to head to a Democratic Party fancy fundraising event. And we decided to march in with a Fight for 15 and organize a march around that rather than just hold a bunch of Bernie signs. We thought it was more important to focus on our issue than to focus on Bernie's name. And here we are with AOC from New York, and Naomi Klein, a very renowned author, and Bernie, of course, and a bunch of kiddos from Sunrise in Iowa, talking about the Green New Deal. We had this summit in Des Moines, Iowa, that lasted 4 hours, that featured local farmers, that featured local activists, talking about how climate has an impact on Iowa and what we can do about it. We brought in the big hitters, brought in AOC, we brought in Naomi Klein, and we had over 2,000 people there, in Iowa. I mean, that's incredible, right? So you can change what is politically possible. And frankly, you have to, if you're going to be involved in policy work. Before I get into my own personal narrative, I want to just quickly say I use a lot of resources. Here's some of the resources and references I use throughout this presentation. Do the fair thing and make sure I give credit where credit is due. So me, how the hell did I end up here? It's kind of crazy. I don't know sometimes how I ended up here, but here's some photos and then I'll just turn on my camera and we'll just talk a little bit. But so we have this ongoing joke in the campaign that, you did 110 events with Bernie in the state of Iowa, and all of them were live streamed. So we had a national and international audience. And I would often bring the mic, or I would help. He would bring me up to talk about some organizing we were doing in Iowa. And he would call me Misty from Grinnell. He would say, Misty's from Grinnell. He was very proud that I was from Iowa. And I'm actually from Gilman, Iowa, which is just north of Grinnell. And I grew up in Gilman, as Jerry said in the beginning. And just to be clear, Gilman, Iowa has 509 people living in it. I really grew up out in the country. And there's my mom. My mom is a meatpacking worker. And that's me with one of our calves that I named Curly. And that's our farm. So I grew up out on a gravel road, no real close neighbors. I went to high school at East Marshall, so in Marshall County, but not in Marshalltown. My mom worked in Marshalltown and my dad was a factory worker. And of course, when we went through the Great Recession, the factories started closing down. So my dad was unemployed a large part through my high school life and then became a truck driver. So I have a very working class background. Never thought I would end up in politics, never really had any ambitions to end up in politics. But I think kind of growing up in rural Iowa and being the daughter of a meat packer and the daughter of a factory worker who had great ambitions for me. They really wanted me to be successful and get through high school. Both my parents, my mom didn't graduate from high school and my dad barely did. I had kind of a chip on my shoulder. I really didn't like it when things seemed unfair or when people were bullied. My mom was a member of the union and I heard all about what was happening at the meat plant. I think that deeply affected me as a young girl. And I just bring that up because people always ask me, why did you care about all these things? I really, in a lot of thinking back, think that was kind of it. But back to my professional life. So after I graduated from the University of Iowa, I started organizing with this group called Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement. That was my first job. And my first campaigns was helping workers recover unpaid wages. So here we are at the, and this is controversial. Some people may think it is, at the house of an employer who basically decided he was just not going to pay his workers, get up and just say one day, I ain't paying you the 10 grand that I owe you 5 people. And that is what it is. And this happens all the time. Wage theft is rampant in this country. It's rampant in Iowa. There's studies all over the place that say it affects workers in different numbers, but wage theft essentially is just not paying workers what they're legally owed. It can look like just not paying them anything, underpaying them, not paying them time and a half, all those things. So I became very involved in workers' rights as my first sort of organizing job. I also was pretty involved in a lot of the big, when we were bailing out the big banks and trying to hold them accountable. I did a lot of campaigning around that. Wells Fargo, as you may know, was involved in a lot of terrible things. So this was an accountability Wells Fargo, a national event that we did all across the country. And there I am with a 90-year-old guy who also felt so compelled to sit on the line there with me. I also did some other really offside projects. I helped to get Occupy Iowa City off the ground. But I really believe, again, Occupy was kind of this interesting moment in this country when narrative shift began to happen. I co-founded the Center for Worker Justice, which is the first and only worker center in the state of Iowa. While I was there, our membership was mostly Latinos, African immigrants, mostly from Northern Africa, Sudan, Togo, but also the Congo, and then Black American workers and white workers. Poor folks getting together and organizing around all different issues, having a place where they could have dignity, have a voice, be treated fairly, have conversations about policy and things they wanted to change in their communities. We did housing, we did wage theft fights, we did we raised the minimum wage. We got the community ID. We did countless adult education classes where I speak Spanish. I was usually translating and interpreting all of our meetings, either from Spanish to English or English to Spanish. Lots of our meetings were also interpreted and translated into French and Arabic. Here we are working on an immigration issue. We saved this woman from getting deported. So we also were doing a lot of deportation defense. And then I left the center. I believe it's really important for turnover of leadership. And I went and I joined Planned Parenthood. And I worked at Planned Parenthood for about 1.5 years, not too long before I jumped into politics. That's Susanna DeBacca, the former CEO. During my time there, Kim Reynolds, our current governor, was defunding the 6 clinics that I was overseeing. So I had the distinct displeasure of shutting down 3 rural healthcare clinics where the majority of those people who went there, that's the only place they got their healthcare, and kind of saw firsthand some terrible issues within our healthcare issues. So that was kind of my first time organizing around healthcare issues, but it stuck. And then I jumped on, I left Planned Parenthood, a job I loved, because a very dear friend of mine who helped me out a lot. We met 10 years ago at that moment. I don't know how long it's been now, but Kathy Glosson, who is one of the founding members of the nurses union at the University of Iowa, became the president a long time ago, decided to run for governor. So I thought there was nothing more important I could be doing in my life than talking to Iowans about getting a different governor. And so I helped run her campaign, and then eventually became the campaign manager. And then I took a little bit of a break and I did some consulting. I worked with One Iowa, which is the LGBTQ organization in the state. And I did some work with Iowa RC&D. And then Bernie called me and asked if I wanted to be the Iowa State Director. And I began that job last March. So almost a year ago. No, 2 years ago. I'm sorry. 2 years, not last March, the March before. Wow, that's crazy. And it's just been a wild ride ever since. So, you know, the Iowa operation, just to give you some context, was the largest state operation we had in the campaign. We had over 300 employees. I was one of the first hires. I built the entire operation. We had 22 field offices. And we were probably the most, we probably organized more Iowans than any presidential campaign ever has, including the Obama campaign. And so that is what we did. And now I am going to stop sharing. And here I am. Okay, I think we're going to take some questions.
Yeah, I'm going to read out these questions to you, Misty, so that you have time to sort of frame your responses as I read out the questions to you. But before I get to Q&A, I really wanted to thank you for a very, very, very great two-part presentation. The first part was so much of information, the new knowledge that I picked up, and also a behind-the-scenes peek at what really goes on. That was fantastic. And some of the highlights of this $1.9 trillion bill that I didn't know, even though I'm one of, we've been keeping track of all of this. So thank you very, very much for that. And your personal story was so inspiring. So thank you so much. There'll be lots of people who are listening in who probably want to sort of follow your footsteps or contact you for more information on how to do all the stuff that you did. And for those of you who are tuning in, Misty presented a whole bunch of things, but there are many, many other things that she has done that are not presented here that I know of. For example, money lending. And, you had a major role in that, in check cashing, the check cashing business. Yes. And predatory check cashing that happens all across the state. So thank you very much for all the work that you've done. So let's now get into questions, and we really are on time. So thank you very much for that. We really are on track here. I'm gonna look at these questions as they are here, and then ask you to respond to them. So question number one, Misty, please briefly talk about how the numerous parts of this $1.9 trillion legislation were brought to the final bill. Who was pushing some of the major elements?
Yeah, so the president. So the president sort of laid out his vision, right, and told us all that we needed to get state and local in there, that we needed to massively increase our resources around the vaccination efforts. And there's some other things, right, that the president was leading pretty early before inauguration even. And then basically it was up to the chairs of all the 11 committees that we worked with. I won't be able to name them all, but, appropriations, ENR, energy and natural resources, environment and public works, finance. So the chairs of all of those committees were really, really crucial. Patty Murray, Ron Wyden, many of those folks were crucial in working with their committee members to bring forward the amendments and how much of each, how much of the bucket they needed, right, to get the work done that was sort of, they wanted to prioritize and was being tasked to them. So I would just say it was, not the chairs don't all deserve all of the credit, because every member, especially the Democratic caucus, and we did sit down quite a bit with Republicans, of course, and had lots of conversations with them too, and found ways in which we could work together. And I will say, you will notice now, even though this bill got zero Republican votes, there are some Republicans out there talking about what's good in this bill for their state. So Republican states benefited quite a bit from this as well. And so generally, I would just say committee level conversations, and then all that kind of working with our budget staff. So Senator Sanders has budget staff, right? And they were taking in these amendments and working with the committees and saying, hey, this isn't going to get through the parliamentarian. This is a violation of the Byrd rule, we think. Let's tweak it this way. So our staff just did an incredible amount of work to help the logistics of all of that happen. But the ideas were coming from the senators. The senators know they have long-term issues that they've been working on for a long time. And this was a good way to make some movement there too.
Great. Our next question is about minimum wage. Misty, in your presentation, you mentioned that the minimum wage segment of this bill was not privileged, and it had to go through the amendment process, and it had to get 60 votes and all of that. What would have happened if the discussion of the minimum wage had started at $22 per hour rather than 15? Do you think that we should have set on a higher amount or a higher number? Now the discussion is 15 and 10. If it had started at 22, could we have gotten to 15 that way through compromise?
Yeah. Well, this is an answer that no one likes, but I'm a realist, and here's the thing. If it was $22, it probably would have gotten less votes from Democrats. So we had 8 Democrats who fell out of caucus and didn't vote in favor of the $15 minimum wage. So there's a starting point, right? But on top of that, there's no campaign in the country asking for a $22 minimum wage. I haven't seen it. The campaign that I've seen for the last 10 years has been $15, right? And so I think this is such a great, I know there's a lot of frustration. People are like, oh my God, it's way too late. Of course it is. So, so we should start campaigning probably for more money as a minimum wage, right? But the reality is politicians are going to meet the demands of the people, right? And that has been the demand, and that is the loudest demand. And frankly, let's just be honest, like if everybody got a $15 minimum wage, 33 million workers would be affected by that. That is a huge, huge increase. It is not absolutely enough. I understand that. But it is what the call has been for a long time. That's where the momentum is. And that is where a lot of politicians are lining up behind. And that is why organizing is so important, because if it's time to shift and change that, it is on us, people to make that demand. And so, quite frankly, I think it would have been terrible if it was more than 15, because we would have lost a ton of votes, and and it would have showed even less support for raising the minimum wage.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's an important clarification, that you can only ask for something that is practically possible, right? And so that's a good direction that you guys went, I guess. Now here's a policy wonky question. Okay, there are many policy wonks in this audience. So what are the measures you are using to track the effectiveness of the stimulus that you provided? Are there any new measures that you might say, any new ways that you're going to measure, like how this entire package has been effective or not?
Yeah, so I know the White House is working on some of that. I just got off a call, actually. They have these just for people who are interested in what it's like to be a chief of staff. There's a chief of staff call that happens where all the chiefs in the Democratic caucus get together several times a week and talk. And we always have people from the White House there kind of briefing us. But there are going to be some things that are happening to make sure that we're tracking, to make sure things are effective. A lot of it's going to go through the OMB. They also just recently hired, what is his name? I know I'll look it up, but there's a person in charge of implementation of this, right? Who's a longstanding economist who's worked a lot on different stuff, who I think is going to be putting those measures in. I don't have specifics on it right now, but it is certainly on mind. So thanks for that question.
Well, the next question is on behalf of all the students. There are many students who are tuning in on this call. And student debt relief is something that is near and dear to your boss. So where do you think that is headed? There is some of it in the stimulus itself, in the package itself, but I know your boss wants much more than that. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, student debt. So the president, says that he supports the cancellation of $10,000. There's some movement in the Senate from Senator Warren and a few others that support $50,000 forgiveness. But during the Biden and Sanders task forces that happened last spring, there's a lot of conversations about college debt and dealing with it. And I was just writing this down the other day because I don't have it memorized. But yeah, so there was an agreement, I believe, in those task forces where we agreed. It's not what we would like. We believe, Senator Sanders believes in universality. We want universal programs that affect everybody, and also think it's a terrible idea to divide the middle class and lower income people, because frankly, we're a lot more in common than people who are making billions of dollars, like Jeff Bezos, for example. But the agreement that we came up with was that people who make less than $120,000 a year, who went to a 2-year or 4-year public school, would get full debt cancellation. So that is also an idea that's being floated. I'm not saying we're going to be able to get that done right now, but I will say there's a lot of different proposals that are happening. There's a lot of talk about it. Leader Schumer is also talking about it. I think there needs to be a really loud demand from the outside of people keeping this very relevant. and on the forefront for our president, because I mean, he can do a lot around this. And and the challenge. So there's some executive order stuff that could happen. But again, back to the challenge that we were talking about in the very beginning with a very slim majority, we also have a caucus problem. Like there's pretty large divisions within the Democratic caucus around what people think is doable here. Some people don't believe in any college debt forgiveness or Democrats, and some like mine believe in all. But I think Senator Sanders and what our office believes right now is getting as much done as we can. We're not gonna, lose our values. We want to draw the line on important things, but we're really interested in delivering to the working class right now. And so that's our priority.
And even on that debt, you have one major thing that has come out of this bill, right? That any forgiven student debt will not be taxable through 2025.
Mm-hmm.
That really opens up the door to make this forgiveness possible and feasible. So
that's right.
Yeah, that's a big thing by itself. Okay, moving on to the next question. Can you talk a little bit about the connections or disconnect between federal and state policies, especially with regard to, say, economic COVID relief, not necessarily about COVID attitudes or masks and vaccine distribution, but states have considerable latitude in the money that they're getting, and cities and counties have a lot of, about a fourth of the bill is actually money for states and counties, states and cities, and they have lots of latitude. So there could be disconnects, right, between what cities and states do and what you guys intended in that bill at the federal level. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that's a really important point. So that's sort of the beauty and the tragedy, I think, of doing something like this, right? Is the limitations around the specifics of each program really cannot go through reconciliation because it's a pure budgetary process. So large in part, it's going to be up to agency heads, right? And then your electeds and agency heads in your state. So it's really important. It's very, very important that you are speaking to your elected officials or working within your agencies to say how you want this to look in your communities, right? And again, I believe this is why local politics and local work is so important. Everybody always focuses on the presidency every 4 years, but who you're electing to your city level, to your county level, to your house, the people involved in the housing trust fund, like the people who are involved in those things matter, because when money comes down, they determine large in part what can happen with this money. But I believe that people should be, those people in powerful positions like that should be accountable to everyday voting people, even just everybody living in their community. And so there's an opportunity to influence that, but you should definitely be reaching out also to your federal electeds. So like Joni Ernst and Grassley, and encouraging them to do, to weigh in on how this money is being used at the state level. I think that, Joni and Chuck are probably going to be very in line with our Governor Kim, but I think, it's important that they continue to hear from what you think should be happening to that. So, I mean, that just kind of demonstrates again, which is one thing I believe is you can't really do policy without politics. And I do want to say something about that before we end today, but so that's kind of my thoughts.
Well, I think that question and your response to that question highlights one of the key sort of limitations, if you will, of the reconciliation process, right? It can't be about policy. It has to be strictly about budget, right? So, yeah. So the next question then is, now that this big thing has passed, where are priorities shifting for your boss and for Congress in general?
Yeah, sure. So you're seeing a lot of things coming out of the House. The House has been just moving a lot of stuff around voting rights, some stuff around immigration, things like that. But also there's a huge need to deal with infrastructure in this country. So you heard this, the president, when he first was inaugurated, talking about we got to do COVID relief. And then you heard him talking about the Build Back Better plan. And that is sort of the infrastructure investment piece, right? So there's going to be shifting to that. How do we take on the broken infrastructure in this country and become more resilient and ready for the disasters that we're going to continue to face as climate change becomes more and more of a reality all across the world, frankly. So moving, of course, away from fossil fuels and getting more into green energies and creating jobs through that initiative. So there's a lot of talk about what kind of infrastructure we need, what scale do we need. I mean, goes all the way down to the electric grid right now. I mean, this stuff is not all that sexy, but it is real. Like, we need to improve our electric grid. And if we really want to go electric, we got to put up like 500,000 charging stations across the country, right? So this is massive, massive investments. I mean, talking about broadband, expanding broadband universally all across the country that we hope will be tied to good paying jobs. And so the senator is very focused on doing his best to, in those conversations, make sure that the parameters around those kinds of investments are attached to ensuring that people have representation on the job and are being paid fair wages. So it's a huge opportunity for our country. And then, of course, you know, some people are also just talking as a part of that. Infrastructure is a broad term. Could you talk about college debt, for example? Could you talk about some of the immigration issues? So some of that stuff is also kind of like trickling around. But I would say the big focus right now is going to be on how do we begin to tackle the major infrastructure issues in front of us.
Well, along the lines of new priorities, a couple of healthcare questions. Can we get Medicare for all? And how do we squash the for-profit system that we currently have?
Yeah, thanks, Angie. Yes, we should keep fighting for Medicare for all. I'm never going to say no to that. I mean, when we have lived during a time where, you know, getting basic healthcare during a pandemic was next to impossible for many people because they could not afford it, or people are too afraid to go to the doctor because they can't afford the bill. We've heard of people being bankrupted from getting COVID and being in the hospital. The system does not work. I mean, it just does not work. And almost every politician on every side of the issue agrees with that, right? So I think it's all about where do we go from here? And there's some things that we can do that continue to get us onto that path, like lowering the age to Medicare, right? So that is a conversation that the senator is having here with a lot of people. Can we do that maybe through reconciliation? What would that look like? And I think it's all about, Angie, always making the case for Medicare for all, why it's a good system. You know, the arguments that people make about, oh, we're waiting in line. I can tell you, whenever I have to go to a specialist for anything, I wait 6 months to see a specialist. Americans wait in lines right now to get the healthcare that we need. So debunking these myths around the terrible system that we'll get, I mean, it's pretty bad. It doesn't get much worse than it is right now. And pushing for Medicare for all. But realistically, I think it's probably going to happen through tweaks that push us further and further towards prescription drug, for example, lowering the age of Medicare would be one. I would say making sure that Medicare can negotiate drug prices, is really important. So there's some of these things that we can do that start to move us in that direction that the senator is very focused on.
Great. We are running out of time, but we still have time for a couple of questions. And I want to segue to the second part of your presentation about your campaigns and all the organizing that you've done. So one question pertaining to that is, how do you pick up on issues before they become high profile? What are some of your sources? How do you select what movements to prioritize?
Yeah, by talking to people. So if an issue is, one of the most important things as an organizer is to not get tied into personal, specific things. Because that is more of a service need, right? And like at the worker center or when you're organizing, it's very easy. Everybody has a lot of problems. And so your job as an organizer is to figure out what problems have scale, how many people are being affected by that problem, and are there real solutions? Like, are there real solutions locally, through the municipality, through the county, through the state, that could move us in a direction to get what we need. So I always think about the scale of the problem. It's got to be an issue that affects many people. It's got to be winnable. These are going to always be the best issues to take on. Not to say that, for example, we were just talking about Medicare for all, and I just said, oh, we're probably not going to get Medicare for all this year. But that doesn't mean you don't keep fighting for it, because it's an issue that affects so many people. But it's also important when you're organizing, especially if you need to keep a base mobilized and engaged, to win. You got to win stuff. People hate, you don't want to be a part of a losing group. No one wants to be on the losing team. So you have to pick some priorities that you can win, get some tangible wins, make people feel good and feel empowered about their ability to affect change. And then you just kind of broaden and get bigger issues. And you have to do a power analysis. You know, when you're deciding what is winnable and what's not, you got to look at the powers that be and how are you going to influence those. I used to do, you know, this big presentation on doing power analysis, because it's one of the most important things you can do to understand how you're going to accomplish your goal. You got to understand where power is, because our entire world and country and definitely you know, political system is about power. So yeah.
Great. Let me ask a follow-up question on that, and then Chuck has his hand raised, so he wants to say something, and then we'll close out with that. You know, what have you found works best to bring together diverse coalitions in organizing and campaigning?
What is best? How to do it? I mean, at the Worker Center, when we were working on the Worker Center, we brought together churches, labor unions, other faith-based organizations, you know, workers from all different industries, under the notion that there were some problems in our community that we were probably better suited to work together on than to try to challenge them alone. And I think, you know, I think one of the important things to always think about is finding out people's self-interest allows you to understand what is going to interest them. So if you're trying to build a coalition, you got to understand it's like good relationship building, having a real relationship, not a transactional relationship, but a transformational relationship. Because if you're trying to do transformational change and policy change together, it means you got to invest in people in other communities, people who look different than you, talk different than you, come from a different walk of life. You know, I went to more mosques and Catholic churches when I was organizing at the Worker Center than I think some people who are of the faith do. You know, I was there all the time, and it was because I knew that I had to invest and show up and become, you know, a reliable person to these communities. If I was going to ask them to get engaged and trust me and the Worker Center on the things that we were taking on, then I also need to show up in their space and be there when they asked us to. So it is a give and take. And I think it can be really, really fun and engaging and amazing. I mean, I learned, you know, it's still kind of the time of my life was doing the work that we did to get the Worker Center off of the ground, because I learned so much about myself and about my community. And that is one of the other things I'll just say is you got to be humble. It doesn't matter how many degrees you have. It doesn't matter how many books you read. It doesn't matter how many political classes you've gone to. You don't know. You just don't know because you didn't walk through that person's shoes, right? So I think being extremely humble and asking questions and being ready to be schooled is so important to building coalitions, not making assumptions out of people. And if you are going to make assumptions, always assuming the best intentions. I think those are the things that, to me, drive healthy coalition building and respectful coalition building.
As we close out, would you want to take about 30 seconds for one final statement from your side to all of us in the audience?
Yeah, I wrote down something kind of that I wanted to just say, and now I just lost the paper. There's a lot of people on here who know me, so I'm going to say a few things. Nobody's path is perfect, and there's a lot of mistakes that we make along the way. And I think that the most important thing that all of us can do, especially if we intend to change the way in which the world functions and improve the world, is to be forgiving of one another and forgiving of ourselves and allowing ourselves opportunities to grow and change. We absolutely must be able to change our opinions about things. And we absolutely must be able to be held accountable and to change our behaviors afterwards. And I think that that is such an important part of engaging with the public. And the other thing I want to say, as practitioners, whether you're a social worker, whether you are a public policy person, you have to be political. I know that there is this idea that you just get to be neutral and you're just there to focus on the housing, or you're just there to get the, you know, public transit figured out, or whatever it may be. But the reality is everything is political. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to, you know, take one side or the other, but it means that you do have to acknowledge the politics at play, and you do have to acknowledge the power. Who has power, why they have power, because those are the people you have to work with to get things done. And if you live in a world where you act as if politics doesn't affect me, I'm just here to like be a practitioner, you're not going to be as effective. You have to be a relationship builder. You have to engage in communities, and you have to do real analysis about what is politically possible and how you as a practitioner can help shift what is politically possible. And so I just want to encourage people, to do that. You got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And the more people who are comfortable being a little uncomfortable and doing things a little different than we have before, the more we're going to be able to improve and change things. So that's my take. And I just want to say one last time, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, and I have not been a perfect leader, and I will continue to make mistakes. I oversee a team now of 60. I oversaw a team of 300 in Iowa. Management is really hard, but we have absolutely got to continue to allow ourselves to learn and grow. And I encourage younger people or less experienced people to remember that there's a lot you can learn from people who've done this work before you. And it's really, really important to humble yourself. Even though you are fresh and you are great and we love you and we need you, you gotta listen to the elders. I'm just gonna put that out there. I kind of see myself in this gap where I know a lot of older folks who've been in this work for a long time, and I know a lot of like 19, 20, and 23-year-olds, and we need to talk more. Those two people need to talk a lot more because we have a lot to learn from each other. So that's how I'll end.
Thank you very much, Misty. This is a fantastic, fantastic presentation. Very, very inspiring, very inspiring. So thank you very much for all the participants. We've more or less stuck to time. We've gone a couple of minutes over, but I hope you believe that it was worth it. I personally think it was really worth it to go a couple of minutes over time. This webinar was recorded and will be available at the website of the School of Planning and Public Affairs. So come to our website in a couple of days and you'll find this entire webinar there. I certainly will be going back and listening to it a couple of times. There's lots of interesting information and lots of inspiring stuff there. So thank you very much, Misty. And with that, we're going to close out to all the participants. Thank you very much for joining us. I know many of you are going to start off right now. Misty for governor committees. Thank you very much. I'll be signing up for that committee as well and contributing. So thank you very much all. Enjoy, have a great weekend. Panelists, could we just stay on the line for a minute and just debrief?
Sure.